Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Bullpen Theater here at the National Baseball Hall of Fame and Museum. Welcome all of you joining us on Facebook Live as well. This is the final of our 10 author series programs that we have here at the Hall of Fame this summer. I guess it's always a little bittersweet to have the author series come to an end, but we will certainly finish up in fine fashion today. With us is really one of the best writers, best authors that we have in America. Normally I give a fairly lengthy introduction, talk about everything that our author has written, publications. Pretty much all I have to say is this gentleman has won the Pulitzer Prize, and that's a pretty good introduction right there. Joining us, David Maraniss. He has written 12 earlier books, including biographies of Roberto Clemente and Vince Lombardi. Here today to talk about his newest, just out really this summer. It is Path Lit by Lightning, the life of Jim Thorpe, arguably the greatest all-around athlete of the 20th century. Please join me in welcoming David Maraniss. Now, David, I'm very tempted for us to spend the next 45 minutes talking about Roberto Clemente, because we've both written on that subject, but I'll avoid that temptation. We will talk about your new book. And this, I should mention, this is an extensive biography. It's about 650 pages, including the index. This is not a book that you can take onto an airplane and finish by the time the plane lands, even if you're going across the world. It's going to take a while. But it is extremely comprehensive. It's really going to be the definitive biography of the great Jim Thorpe. David, when did you first decide that you wanted to write about Thorpe, that you wanted this as a subject? And then once you did that, how long did it actually take you to finish once you started putting pen to paper?
Well, thank you, Bruce. Thank you all for coming. So actually, it was about 20 years ago that I was in Denver on a book tour for another book, and a member of the Oneida Nation in Wisconsin was there, and afterwards he said, "David, you've got to do a book on Jim Thorpe," and he handed me some papers and something. And I don't take advice from other people about what books I'm going to write, because I have to be obsessed. So I didn't realize that he planted a seed, but he had. And after Lombardi and after Clemente, I was looking for what I thought might be sort of the third book in a trilogy of sports figures who transcend sports. Thorpe, that just came back to me, that seed grew, and I realized that's the book I have to do, because it does, in a different way, what Lombardi and Clemente did, which is both offer the opportunity to write about a fascinating athletic figure, and the drama that sports provides through that, but also illuminate American history and sociology through that person. So with Thorpe, it was not just that he was, he did unparalleled things as an athlete. No one before or since has won a decathlon and pentathlon, been an All-American football player, and been a Major League Baseball player. That trifecta is unparalleled. But it also offered me the opportunity to explore the Native American experience through his life. Mm-hmm. He was born in the Sac and Fox Nation in Oklahoma, and the obstacles that he faced throughout his life were emblematic of what all Native Americans have faced in some ways.
How many years to write this?
It took about 4.5 years, and it was different than any other book I've done because of COVID.
Yeah, was that just the writing, or did that include the research too?
No, generally, most of my books take between 3 and 5 years. And the first 1.5 years, I'm just researching. And the second part of it, I'm still researching, but also start to write. So that's the way I do it.
The first part of the title, Path Lit by Lightning, what does that mean?
Jim Thorpe was born in 1887 in the Indian Territory of what became Oklahoma. He was actually a twin. He had a brother, Charlie, who was his twin. And the night they were born in May of 1887, there was a thunderstorm outside and lightning. and his name was given to him by his parents. It's a Sac and Fox name, Wathoha, and the most poetic translation is Path by Lightning. As soon as I saw that, I said, that's a good book. It's, it illuminates everything.
Yeah. The Sac and Fox Nation, they native to the Oklahoma area, any other states as well?
Well, not native to Oklahoma, they were forced there.
Forced there.
Like most Indian nations. They started in the Illinois, Wisconsin area. One of Thorpe's ancestors was Black Hawk, the great warrior, who Thorpe's mother told him that he was the reincarnation of Black Hawk. That was 80 years earlier. Black Hawk actually tried to lead a group of Sac and Fox back across the Mississippi after the federal government pushed most of the tribes across to the west. That created the Black Hawk War, which maybe you've heard about, in which 3 American presidents fought in. Abraham Lincoln was with the Illinois militia. Zachary Taylor was an officer stationed in Wisconsin. And Jefferson Davis, who became the president of the Confederate States of America, was an officer under Zachary Taylor and actually led Black Hawk after he was captured to the prison in St. Louis. But anyway, so that effort to come back was unsuccessful. The Sac and Fox were pushed first down into Iowa, then many of them to Kansas, and then finally to Indian Territory in Oklahoma.
As a youngster, was he inclined to follow Native American traditions?
Absolutely. The notion of blood quantum, which is how much of a Native American you are, is something that was imposed on most Native Americans by the white government to determine how much they could get in their reservations and so on. But so Jim Thorpe had, his father was Sac and Fox and English, some, and his mother was Potawatomi and Kickapoo and some French. But he grew up on the Sac and Fox land, and everything about his upbringing was geared toward being a Native American. He started going to the Indian boarding schools. He and Charlie, his twin brother, at a fairly early age, first to the Sac and Fox School in Stroud, Oklahoma, where sadly his twin Charlie died at age 9 of a fever that ran through the school. And then Jim went to Haskell Institute in Lawrence, Kansas, another Indian boarding school, and finally to Carlisle Indian Industrial School, where he gained world fame.
You mentioned the Carlisle School. It existed from 1879 until 1918. And in reading your book and reading some of the other things you've written online, it is shocking how badly he and those other young people were treated there. It's just incredible.
Well, it was established in 1879, only 3 years after the Battle of the Little Bighorn. Most of the first students there were Lakota Sioux, the sons and daughters of some of the people who fought against Custer. The entire mission of that school was summarized by its founder, Richard Henry Pratt, who was a former military officer. Kill the Indian, save the man, which meant that rid them of all of their Indianness, of their language, their culture, their religion, cut their braids and dress them in the uniform of the U.S. cavalry. So that was the effort. It was a total, almost forced assimilation and acculturation, starting in 1879. By the time that Thorpe got there in 1904, fewer of the students were dying, although they were still dying. 186 students at Carlisle are buried in the Indian cemetery there, student cemetery. So, in a sense, it was not just killing the Indians, saving the men, but killing these young kids. But Thorpe's existence there was more complicated than that. Because he was an athlete, because he was a great athlete, he considered his Carlisle experience one of the best periods of his life, even as he understood this larger assimilation effort was going on. Most of the students who went there figured ways around that and were able to maintain their native identities, even as the government was trying to sort of beat that out of them.
All these children that died there, was this mostly because of physical abuse or neglective illness that they had? Combination of the two?
Yeah, it's complicated, like most things in life. I mean, there was physical abuse. I document in one chapter about, the beatings that a lot of these students took. I don't know that killed them. They also came to Carlisle with various diseases and also were exposed for the first time to white society and its diseases, and that also, historically killed a lot of natives, throughout the Western Hemisphere. Some of it was just the conditions there as well, to a certain extent. So it was all of those things. But nonetheless, I mean, when you think about how many students would die naturally at a school, it's way above the norm. Yeah.
Somehow Thorpe survived. Did he thrive under this?
He survived and eventually thrived. He arrived in 1904. He was 16 years old. And unbelievable to me, when you see any picture of Jim Thorpe, he stood 5'5" and weighed 116 pounds. He had an enormous growth spurt after that, obviously. Yeah. And for the first 3 years of his time there, he wasn't really there much. And it was part of what I consider to be sort of a government scam, where Carlisle would take students and then send them out as basically indentured servants to local farms in Maryland, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania on what they called the outing system. And they were paid a nominal amount. Some of the farmers were wonderful to the kids and some of them were awful to them. But in either case, the students weren't getting the money for that. It was going back to the school, and the school was being paid at the same time for the government for having them at the school, because it was a government-run school. So Jim Thorpe, for his first 3 years, was mostly working on farms in the area. Then he ran away from one and came back and stayed at Carlisle. And it was in 1907, when he was working on the school farm, that he walked by the track, saw some guys on the track team trying to clear the high jump bar at probably about 6 feet. And they were not successful, and Jim Thorpe in his overalls cleared the bar. And the next day he was on the track.
He played football at Carlisle as well. His coach was a legendary figure, Pop Warner.
Yes.
But their relationship, not that easy.
Well, it was a codependency, I would say. Pop Warner was a truly brilliant football coach. He was inventive. He was the early innovator of the forward pass, which was just made legal only a few years before Thorpe got there. He developed the single wing and double wing offenses. And, in that era, you could do things in football that are sort of fun, but you could never do again. He designed a uniform for one of his players that had a pocket in it, and they'd hide the football in the pocket. Another play, you could do this too. He had an end line up right by the sidelines, and then go around the opposition bench and come out on the other side. You could do that legally. So Warner was always devising trick plays along with all this other stuff. Right. And Carlisle was not really a college, it was an industrial school, but they played against all of the great colleges of that period in football and other sports. And in that era, hard to believe now, it wasn't Alabama and LSU and Ohio State and whatever. It was Harvard and Penn and Yale and Princeton and West Point and Syracuse. Carlisle would play them and mostly beat them. Jim Thorpe got on the team in 1907. By 1908, he was a third team All-American, and then it just rose from there.
Yeah. Did he play baseball at Carlisle as well?
He did. He played baseball in 1909, particularly. He was a pitcher, a very good pitcher, first base and outfield, and that's the start of his troubles, actually, in a sense, because many of the Carlisle Indian athletes played summer baseball. And so after the 1909 season, for Carlisle, for the school, he went down to play summer baseball in North Carolina, in the Eastern Carolina League. And I can talk all about that because that's why he lost his gold medals.
Yeah.
He played there in 1909 and 1910. Literally scores of college athletes were playing summer baseball in that period. Most of them were doing it under aliases. Lou Gehrig played under an alias. Dwight Eisenhower played under the name Wilson in the Kansas State League. The Eastern Carolina League, where Thorpe played, had so many aliases that the joke was they called it the Pocahontas League because everybody was named John Smith. Jim Thorpe played under the name Jim Thorpe. He never tried to hide it. His name was in the newspapers from Charlotte and Raleigh to all the small towns of that league every day for 2 summers.
He goes to the Olympics 1912, wins the gold in the decathlon and the pentathlon, 2 highly stressful events. But then later stripped of the medals, purportedly because of this professional ball player status. But as you've already pointed out, this was being done by countless other athletes, so this sounds like a complete sham of a reason. Would you say that's accurate?
I would. I mean, first of all, getting back to the Olympics, I mean, what he did in Stockholm was stunning. Not only did he compete in the 15 events, 5 of the pentathlon and 10 of the decathlon, he also competed in the long jump and the high jump, and he won those 2 gold medals. Think about it, competing in 17 different events over 2 weeks. And for the decathlon, he competed in those 10 events in 3 days. And at one point, he misplaced his shoes and competed in mismatched shoes that they found in a garbage can or somewhere, and he had to wear 2 socks on 1 foot to make it fit, and he still won that event. I mean, so then he comes back to the U.S. truly, after the King of Sweden had declared him the greatest athlete in the world, hailed in parades in New York City, and in Philadelphia and Carlisle. And then in January of 1913, a reporter at the Worcester Telegram in Massachusetts was told that someone had come to town and talked to the manager of a team from the Eastern Carolina League who had managed Jim Thorpe in pros. And it broke into this scoop, this big story, even though it had been in North Carolina for those 2 previous years. And so quickly it got back to James E. Sullivan, the head of the American Olympic Committee, and he was also the head of the Amateur Athletic Union, and to the superintendent at Carlisle, and to Pop Warner. All 3 of them, these major figures in the Thorpe's rise, lied about it to save their own reputations and said they didn't know what Thorpe was doing. Pop Warner definitely knew. He'd had Indian athletes playing summer baseball for years. Thorpe was scouted by one of Warner's best friends to go down to Carolina. During the period when Thorpe wasn't there, Warner went hunting with him once for 3 days. You think they didn't talk about why his best athlete wasn't back at school? The superintendent wrote letters to Thorpe saying, I don't want you to play summer baseball, and then denied that he knew about it. James E. Sullivan, for whom the great amateur award is given each year, was also on the board of advisors to the Carlisle Athletic Association. He claimed he didn't know about it. But beyond that, there's so many other things that were going on. One was, as I said, that so many other amateurs, quote unquote, were actually not in various ways. A lot of football players in all of these teams were getting paid. We often long for the innocent past and, knew the present and how, athletes are corrupt now. Well, they're all, it's not the athletes, the system was corrupt from the beginning in that sense. And many college football players in the 1910s and 20s were getting paid to play, but still maintaining their amateur status. One of Thorpe's teammates on the Olympic team was George S. Patton, who would become, the great general of World War II. Patton competed in an event called the modern pentathlon, which was military-style events, target shooting, rifle shooting, equestrian, fencing. And he had been practicing for months for those events on the government payroll. Is that an amateur or is that a pro?
Yeah.
Thorpe was called a pro for playing some sport that he wasn't even part of what he competed in. The entire Swedish team was let off for 6 months from their job, 6 months before the Olympics, because they were the hosts, to practice, to train for those Olympics while they were still getting paid from their old job. Is that a pro or is that an amateur?
Yeah.
So in so many ways, the whole notion of amateurism was contradictory and somewhat of a sham. Furthermore, even technically, Thorpe shouldn't have had his medals taken away because technically there was a rule of the Olympics that any challenge to someone's amateurism had to be filed within 30 days of the end of the Olympics. And the story in the Worcester Telegram broke 6 months later. So even technically, it shouldn't have happened.
Yeah.
So in so many ways, it was morally wrong and also technically wrong for him to lose those medals.
You think they were just searching for a reason because of his Native American heritage?
I think that's probably stretching it some. I mean, I try to use common sense on this. I think that was definitely a factor. I think it was easier for them to use Jim Thorpe as a scapegoat, throw him under the bus, certainly rather than acknowledge the duplicity of everybody else involved in this. So yes, I think that was definitely a factor.
And Pop Warner made no effort to come to his defense, no argument saying, hey, this is not right, we need to...
No, this is the interesting thing. Pop Warner did come to his defense, but also lied about what he had done. So he was trying to have it both ways.
Yeah.
That was sort of the way their relationship worked. Pop Warner wrote the letter of Jim Thorpe's confession. And he ghost wrote it in a way that made Jim sound like, oh, I'm just an ignorant Indian, which was insulting to Thorpe, who was, not. But that was sort of the defense that Warner wanted to use. And it was a way of laying all the blame on Jim with this rationalization that he didn't know any better. Well, Pop Warner knew better.
Yeah. In doing the research on this rather complicated incident, any sense on what Thorpe's reaction was? Did he ever publicly come out and say, hey, this is an outrage, this is just absolutely wrong? Did he ever do that?
Well, his first reaction was, well, this is just another obstacle for the American Indian. I mean, he did feel that, but he was an athlete first and foremost. And right after he lost his gold medals, he went on to play Major League Baseball and then professional football and even some basketball. So he was mostly concentrating on his life as an athlete. It was only later, after his athletic skills diminished, that he really focused more on the unfairness of what had happened to him.
So he starts playing in the major leagues in 1913 after several years in the minor leagues. I may have the timeline wrong, but I think his pro football career would begin 2 years later, 1915.
Yes.
He was a better athlete in football than baseball, so why did he play baseball first?
Baseball is where the money was. And baseball was a much bigger, pro football in that era was barely an organized sport. But baseball, the big time sports were college football, professional baseball, boxing, horse racing, tennis. Pro football was way below all of those. Now it dominates everything, but in that era, I mean, there was no NFL. There was, when he finally joined into professional football, it was the Ohio League, for Canton, Ohio. So, and Pop Warner arranged, their codependence continued after he lost his medals. It was Warner who sort of served as his agent to get him signed by the New York Giants in 1913. And that they paid him, fairly good salary. I mean, maybe $5,000 or something, or $10,000 at max. But there was money, and now that he couldn't be an amateur anymore, that's where he went.
Yeah. He ends up playing parts of 6 seasons in the major leagues, initially with the New York Giants, later with the Reds, the Boston Braves.
Yeah.
Career statistics not that impressive offensively. He was an outfielder. Let me ask you to play scout for a moment. If you were to give a scouting report on what kind of a ball player he was, what would that be?
It would be that he was fast, he was good at stealing bases, he had some trouble with the curveball, and he was, he had power, but he was mishandled. That's my basic conclusion. He was mostly signed because he was famous. John McGraw, the manager of the Giants, knew that at the end of that 1913 season, the Giants were going on a world tour with the Chicago White Sox to take baseball to the world. Mm-hmm. So they went to Japan and China and Australia and Philippines and Egypt and then Europe. And there were famous people on that trip from the perspective of the U.S., including McGraw himself and Comiskey, the owner of the White Sox, and Hall of Famers Tris Speaker and Sam Crawford. But nobody in the world had ever heard of any of them. They knew Jim Thorpe. He'd been declared the best athlete in the world. So he was the one that everybody wanted to see on this trip. And similarly, even in the U.S., part of it was to have Jim Thorpe on your team gave it a certain status. But McGraw really didn't give him a chance. He would play in spring training, and then they'd come up north, and he'd sit on the bench. The Giants played in the 1913 World Series against the Philadelphia A's. Thorpe didn't even get into any games.
Yeah.
So
what about on the tour? Did he play much on the tour?
He played consistently on the tour and did really well, interestingly. And McGraw, during the tour, would talk about how Thorpe is showing that he's going to be a great ball player. But then they got back and he didn't get to play. So that happened on and off for several years, where Thorpe would be on the Giants, or McGraw would send him to the minors, or at one point, as you say, traded him to the Cincinnati Reds, who were managed by Christy Mathewson, who was a Giant, basically, you know. And so it was an inside deal, and then at the end of before the end of the season, he went back to the Giants, but didn't play again. So he finally got his real chance, his best chance, with the Boston Braves in 1919. He played almost the entire season for the Braves. For most of the season, he led the National League in hitting. He had a great season. He was up there with Ty Cobb, and Babe Ruth and Jim Thorpe were the two names in the Boston papers as dominating baseball. That was just one great season. And he was already, in his 30s. He didn't start playing until he was 27. And by the time he really got his chance, he was in his 30s.
Yeah.
And so I don't know. I mean, I've talked to a lot of baseball historians, have mixed feelings about it. He did have trouble with the curveball. He was inconsistent. He did have a drinking problem, but so did so many baseball players. And that.
Right.
John McGraw himself was a drinker. So I don't think that's the reason that he struggled.
Do you think it was a case, David, of McGraw not liking him personally, or he just felt, well, he's a great athlete, but he's not necessarily a great ball player?
I can't honestly answer that. I think it was a little bit of both. I mean, not that he didn't like Thorpe, but he thought that Thorpe was kind of dangerous in the clubhouse because he always wanted to wrestle with the other players. He's afraid he hurt his best player or something. Thorpe didn't handle, McGraw didn't handle Thorpe as well as Pop Warner did, for all of Pop Warner's faults.
Yeah.
He understood that Jim he needed the action, he needed to play. That's how, that was his life. And to sit him on the bench was destroying that. So I think that he was misused. The reasons for that, I can't conclude anything other than that McGraw didn't see Thorpe as his type of ball player.
Yeah.
For some reason.
So you think if he had come up at an earlier age,
Yes.
been given more consistent playing time, might not have been a star, but might have been a very competent starting outfielder.
He would have been better than Michael Jordan. Yes, he would have been a competent first baseman, outfielder. He actually was a pretty good pitcher at Carlisle, and then he hurt his arm playing in the Eastern Carolina League, so that was out of the question. I think he would have been a very good Major League Baseball player.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about his football days. He was, I guess, primarily a halfback in, what eventually would become the NFL. What was his calling card as a football player? Was it more the speed and the strength, or do you think it was a combination of the two?
His calling card in football was everything. He could do anything on a football field. In that era, the players played the entire game, 60 minutes. So Thorpe was a left halfback. He was fast and strong.
And he was a defensive back.
And he was a defensive back / linebacker. In college, the Jim Thorpe Award was given to the best college defensive back. He played linebacker as much. It was a little bit different system then because there wasn't as much passing.
Yeah.
But he not only was a great halfback who, in one of his college seasons, although, as you and Bill Francis would know, statistics in that era are a little bit iffy anyway. When you try to figure out from the box scores and the sports writers of that era who did what, it's not like he had the Elias Sports Bureau or anything like that. So, but in one college year, he probably ran for 2,000 yards. And was a great defensive back. And he was a brilliant punter. He routinely punted 70, 80 yards. And he was a great field goal kicker. He beat Harvard single-handedly or single-footedly. In a great game in 1911, upset Harvard with all of his field goals. So he could literally do anything on a football field. Probably the Harvard game in 1911 and the game against Army in 1912 were the two football games that made him a national figure because both were covered by the national press. And particularly that 1912 game, because here you had the Indians against the Army. It had so much more resonance than just a regular football game. And Pop Warner played it up, said, these are the people that killed your ancestors, and it was a level playing field at last.
Yeah.
And the Carlisle Indians clobbered Army. They beat them 27-6. Jim Thorpe was the star of that game. One of the players on the Army team was Dwight Eisenhower, who played halfback and linebacker. And Eisenhower would later say, yeah, I tackled Jim Thorpe once, meaning once in the whole game. Eventually he was knocked out of the game by Thorpe. And then going into his pro life, at Canton he was the player coach. And incredibly, the best player in that league. And football historians say that really football's rise began when Jim Thorpe entered.
Yeah. Is there any footage of him at all playing in the NFL?
There's very, very little, scanty footage to see Jim Thorpe as an athlete, which is, there's a little bit, but not much. And even at Stockholm, I found this wonderful documentary that made me feel like I was there, 2 hours of the Stockholm Olympics. And it was redone by a great documentarian to make it look like, the real thing instead of that herky-jerky of
Yeah.
Israel. You see Thorpe a couple of times, just for a split second.
Yeah.
Mostly you see him getting his trophies and medals. So
you really had to rely on the newspaper reports describing the kind of player he was.
exactly. And I don't have it with me, but this is another fascinating thing about Thorpe's life. He intersected with so many famous people in different ways. When he was at Carlisle, one of his teachers in the business school was Marianne Moore, who's one of the great poets of American letters. And Marianne Moore grew up in Carlisle, and she just graduated from Bryn Mawr, and her first job was teaching at Carlisle. And she loved her Native American students. She didn't like the school at all. She thought it was a penitentiary. But she would watch. She later became a great baseball fan, as maybe you know. She wrote a poem about the Dodgers, and she loved the Yankees and Dodgers, and she was very good at sports. But she described Jim Thorpe and his equilibrium in the backfield, and sort of described him in a beautiful way, which sort of helped me understand the electricity, the magnetism that he had before you get into action.
When I think about him playing as a running back, I kind of get an image of Earl Campbell knocking people over.
Yeah, well, he was fast and strong. The opposition would claim that he had some kind of metal in his shoulder pads, which is not true. He's just that strong and knocked him out. Yes, I think Earl Campbell's a pretty good description of that. He wasn't as big as Campbell, as muscular. In that era, they didn't lift weights. Thorpe at his prime was probably 6 feet and 185 pounds.
Really?
Yeah, 188 pounds. He got up to 200 in the pros, but he did.
We'd like to take your questions as well for our guest, David Maraniss, about the life of Jim Thorpe. If you have a question, we'll ask you to raise your hand, tell us your name and where you're from. And while we wait for some of those questions, I want to talk about his personal life because it was not easy. Multiple marriages, problems with alcohol, which you referenced a few moments ago, financial woes, obviously all sorts of bigotry throughout all stages of his life. This was not an easy life, really start to finish.
No, it wasn't. And, as I say in the book, he faced a lot of obstacles, some of his own doing and some of society's. He actually played sports until he was 45. And his last athletics was baseball again. He played for the Harjo's Indians, a traveling baseball team from Holdenville, Oklahoma, that traveled the country playing against other traveling teams and Negro League teams. He played against the Kansas City Monarchs and the Pittsburgh Crawfords. He played against Satchel Paige and Josh Gibson and Cool Papa Bell. And then they went out east and played against the Brooklyn Bushwicks and a bunch of those pretty good semi-pro teams at age 45. But by then he was basically finished in sports, and his life was a struggle. I documented him living at various points in 20 different states. He had jobs ranging from digging ditches during the Depression in Los Angeles to being a merchant marine at age 57 during World War II, to being a greeter at various bars at different periods. And the most interesting jobs he had were in Hollywood. He ended up in Los Angeles, and he was on the fringes of the studio system. He acted in about 70 different movies.
Yeah.
And got to know all of the Hollywood stars for that period. But he was an extra in most of the movies. Even sometimes the advertisements say with Jim Thorpe or starring Jim Thorpe, and you barely see him in the movie.
Yeah.
Because he was famous. But
he was one of the theater goers in King Kong.
He was, exactly. He was directed by Frank Capra and John Ford and all of the famous directors at various times.
Why did Hollywood like him?
Well, they liked his name. Whether they really liked him is another question. I mean, what he did in that period, which was admirable, was he became the spokesperson, the leader for all of the Native Americans who were out there trying to get into get parts in all of the westerns. This was there when so many westerns were being made, and there were about 200 to 300 from Native Americans from various places who were out there trying to get those jobs. And often, the Indians were being played by white people dressed in grease paint. So Thorpe sort of became the spokesperson for them, saying, give us the jobs that we deserve. And also trying to get at the negative stereotypes that were in so many of those movies of the Indians. So that was probably one of the stronger periods of that difficult afterlife he had after. But he died in 1953 in a trailer park of a heart attack in Alameda, California. And it was he never found the stability that he hoped he could find. And a couple of the chapters a little bit earlier document his letters he was sending to his second wife and girlfriend, where it's almost like he's a Willy Loman character. I'm about to make it. I'm in Florida. I'm going to be in real estate. Everything's booming down here. I can be a promoter of sports. Every letter he thinks he's found something. It really never happens.
Yeah, the optimist, but
Yeah.
maybe not the pragmatist.
Right.
We talked briefly, or you mentioned briefly, about his problems with alcohol. As if that's not bad enough, that also fed into the stereotypes. Many newspaper headlines referred to him as drinking firewater and having
Exactly.
problems using euphemisms for drink, almost a parody of that problem.
Well, that's something he faced his entire life. Whether it was firewater or, whenever he did something, he was on the warpath or scalping something, that's just the way the press treated Native Americans in that period. Every Indian was called chief, they were chiefs. So, yes, but in the drinking, that's absolutely true. He did struggle. His first two wives left him, divorced him essentially because he was drinking too much and he wasn't home enough because he was always out trying to make money, basically. So it was difficult, but what I conclude, you could look at those last 30 years of his life and say, this is a tragedy. This was the best athlete in the world, and what happened? Well, first of all, a lot of athletes have unfortunate afterlives. It's just sadly the case. Their best moments of their life come at, often before age 30. But more than that, when I was writing those last chapters, I was thinking, well, is this a tragedy or not? And I started to think about why I wrote the book in the first place, which was to illuminate the Native American experience through his life. And he, in 1915, the most popular statue in America was called The End of the Trail. And it showed an Indian slumped on horseback. And the meaning was, it's over. Manifest destiny has prevailed. Progress has made the Indian obsolete. It's a dying race. And it didn't happen. Just as Kill the Indian, Save the Man didn't take the culture away from Native Americans. And the number of Native Americans in this country in 1915 was under 300,000. And it's grown ever since, as has that self-identity. And so I started to look at that perseverance as a way of looking at Jim Thorpe's life too. He had all of these obstacles, including the ones he made himself, but he just kept trying and growing and persevering.
In the offices earlier today, you made a very interesting point that I'd never thought of. You talked about how the bigotry and the racism that Native Americans have faced over the years is very different from the bigotry that Black Americans have faced.
Yes.
Explain that.
Well, first of all, they both suffered from genocide in different ways and of discrimination. But when you think about Native Americans, the society at large basically romanticized them and diminished them at the same time. So many, Americans proudly say, well, I have some Native American blood, and so you don't hear anybody saying I got some black blood, that's part of it. Secondly, Jim Thorpe could play Major League Baseball in 1913, when there was a color line, when African Americans couldn't play. There were several major leaguers, in that era. Albert Bender, also from Carlisle, was an Hall of Famer, right? One of the great pitchers of all time with the Philadelphia A's. He was another Indian. Zach Wheat was partly Native American. They could all play in the major leagues when African Americans couldn't. Jim Thorpe, during the rest of his life, was heralded. He could go to a touchdown club in Jackson, Mississippi, or somewhere in Louisiana, and give a speech at a time when no African American could get in there unless they were the waiter. So there were vast differences in the way that Native Americans were still denigrated, stereotyped, segregated against in some ways, but not in the same way that African Americans were.
One thing that's amazing to me is this characterization of Native American players by the nickname of Chief, which you briefly mentioned. This continued until the early 1970s. I think the last pitcher or last player who was called Chief was a reliever, a very good pitcher named Jack Aker. And I remember Jack Aker in the early 70s, not that long ago.
Right.
But that stereotyping, that continued throughout that period of time. So yeah, they're allowed to play, but they're still playing under difficult circumstances, stereotyping. It lasted a long time.
Most of these guys knew how to handle that. They understood that that's what they were going to be called, and just dealt with it. But yes, that stereotyping, it's just been persistent in American history. Yeah, absolutely.
The book is Path Lit by Lightning, The Life of Jim Thorpe. It is the definitive biography, I think we can safely say, of an athlete that was tremendously famous in his time, but perhaps has become forgotten by some of the newer generations. And maybe that'll change because of your book. David, appreciate your time. It's been very enlightening. Thank you. I want to thank everybody for joining us here in the theater, also on Facebook Live. Those of you here at the Hall of Fame, if you'd like to join us in the atrium, we're going to head out for the book signing portion of the program. The book is available for sale in the bookstore, which is outside as well. If you'd like to have David sign the book, personalize it, he'd be happy to do that. So please join us in the atrium as we continue our program today with the Pulitzer Prize-winning writer, David Maraniss. Thanks again, David.
Thank you.